Hi, my name's Jade and welcome to my channel. Here on my channel, I am typically talking about books. This is a booktube channel where I talk about the books that I'm currently reading, the books that I have read, and the books that I want to read. But today I have a very different kind of video for you guys. As you can tell from the title, this video is going to be about my ectopic pregnancy story. Before I get into any of the meat of this video, I want to say that if you are one of my regular viewers, please do not feel obligated to watch this video. I think the title of the video speaks for itself. This is the traumatic thing that I went through in August that led me to my second reading slump of the summer, and I am finally ready to talk about it. Honestly, I'm primarily making this video for myself. I think it's going to help me to continue to heal from this, but also for other women who have had ectopic pregnancies or are going through ectopic pregnancies. I know that when this was happening to me, I watched a ton of YouTube videos of other people's stories. And I also wanted to share my story because my experience with this was actually not quite as scary as what a lot of other people go through. And what happened to me isn't something that I saw in any of the videos that I watched. So I want to put my story out there because it's a little different and a little less scary than what some other people went through. Not to say that you shouldn't be scared of ectopic pregnancies, but just so that people know they're not always like the worst case scenario that you hear about. I do think this video is gonna be a little long. I wanna talk about what I went through leading up to the pregnancy because not only am I going to be talking about my ectopic in this video, but I'm also basically coming out to you guys and talking about my infertility because we have actually been trying to get pregnant for quite a while. So I'm going to start by talking about that, and then I want to talk about finding out I was pregnant and what it was like to be pregnant, and then I'll talk about the aftermath of the ectopic and losing the pregnancy. So starting from the beginning, we decided we were finally ready to start a family in 2019, and in April of 2019 is when we officially started trying. I knew from pretty early on, like before we even started trying, that it might not be super easy for me just because I have never had really regular periods, which means that I don't ovulate regularly, and to get pregnant you have to ovulate, which means like releasing an egg. So from the very beginning I've been talking with my OB, and she was pretty open to helping us with interventions early on. Fast forward to about February of 2020, we had tried naturally for a while and then tried a few rounds of a fertility drug called Clomid with no results. And so at that point, my OB referred us to a fertility specialist, a reproductive endocrinologist. Around May, we started doing some diagnostic testing, just making sure that there was nothing obviously wrong. And all of our diagnostic testing came back normal, which on the one hand is good. It means that there's nothing obviously wrong, but it's also not good because there's no explanation for us not having been able to get pregnant for, at this point, a little over a year. So once I got all of my diagnostic testing back and everything looked good, my fertility specialist was ready to try a new fertility drug for me. And so we did a round of something called letrozole, which for a lot of people works better than Clomid. So I was excited to try something new. And we chose to do this with just timed intercourse, no other interventions. There are a lot of other things that you can do before you get to IVF that I know are still options for us in the future. But at this point, I just wanted to try timed intercourse with this new drug, letrozole, for a few cycles to see if it would work. Okay, so moving on to finding out I was pregnant. This new drug did work for me, and the first month that we tried it, I got pregnant. And I was so shocked when I saw those two lines because at that point it had been 14 months of trying. I was very, very used to getting negative pregnancy tests. I'm actually someone who tests early and tests often, which in the TTC world is, I don't want to say controversial, but a lot of people don't like to do that. They like to wait until they've already missed their period before they take a test because negative pregnancy tests can be disappointing, obviously, but also when you find it really early, like before a missed period, the chances of a loss are a lot higher, and I'm referring to like chemical pregnancies. But for me, I have found that if I don't test, then I start to symptom spot and I convince myself that I'm pregnant, and it only leads to greater disappointment when I get a negative pregnancy test later. So for me, it actually works a lot better if I test early and I test every day, and that way that morning I see a negative test and I'm like, okay, I'm not pregnant. Whatever symptoms I feel today are probably not pregnancy related, and it just helps me to stay more grounded. So at 10 DPO of this letrozole cycle, I take a test, I look at it, looks negative, I walk away. A couple hours later, I come back to my bathroom and I look at the test again and I'm like, wait, I kind of see a line. Like, I think I see something. But obviously at that point, it was outside of the, normal time limit that you're supposed to look at pregnancy tests. And so I was kind of thinking that it was what we call an EVAP line, an evaporation line, which is when a line shows up outside of the testing window and it's not a real positive. The thing is, though, is that I've used the same tests. I use Premom Internet Cheapies because I test so often. I need really cheap tests. And I've never seen an EVAP line on them. And like I said, I test all the time. I take like a minimum of 7 pregnancy tests every cycle, and I had never seen an EVAP line on these before. So I was optimistic, but also telling myself not to get too excited. I did take another test later that same day, and it was totally negative. And I was like, okay, I just gotta wait till tomorrow and see what happens. So the next day at 11 DPO, I take another pregnancy test, and this time there is definitely a faint line. Like, it's faint, but I know that it's there, and it showed up immediately with, not outside of the time limit. And I was so excited, I ran out and told my husband right away. A lot of people do like really fun and cute surprises for their significant others when they tell them they're pregnant, but I didn't do any of that. I mean, at this point, we had been trying for so long that there was no way I could wait to tell my husband. I needed to tell him immediately, and he was really excited, although he was a little skeptical because the line was so faint, and I had to explain that, like, no, if there's a line at all, that means it's there. But I also told him, finding out this early means that there is a higher chance that it won't last. I think when you find out before a lost period, there's like a 25% chance that your pregnancy won't make it out of the first trimester, which is a lot, and that's like a quarter of the time. So, we were both cautiously optimistic. I actually had him go and get some of the more expensive pregnancy tests that day. I had him get a couple of the first response tests as well as a couple of digitals. The next day, I took a first response and it was very clearly positive. Still fairly faint, but very clearly positive. And I didn't take the digital yet because if you don't know, digital pregnancy tests take more HCG to be positive, so I didn't want to waste it, so I waited and took that one the next day, and it came up pregnant. This was all happening over a weekend, and we did end up actually texting our immediate family and our close friends, all of who already knew that we had been trying for quite a while to get pregnant, just to share the good news. A lot of times people don't tell others early because they don't want to get anyone's hopes up or have to deal with what happens if they lose the pregnancy. And we had discussed that, but we decided, we've been trying for 14 months. We've never seen that second line, and we were just so happy, and we wanted to share that excitement with our close friends and family while it lasted. We were fully aware that it might not last, but we wanted to celebrate the moment while we could. Okay, so then on Monday morning, I call my RE and tell them I got a positive test. So they scheduled me to come get my blood drawn. Because I'm being followed by an RE, a fertility specialist, my pregnancy was followed very closely from the very beginning, which honestly, I'm at this point really grateful for, because if I hadn't been, I would have never known that I had an ectopic pregnancy. I would have just known that it was an early pregnancy loss. So on Tuesday, I go in for my first beta HCG, which came back at like 80 or something, which is low, but I was also very early. And really, the actual numbers don't matter. What they're looking for is they're looking to see how quickly your HCG rises. So what you hear a lot is that your HCG should double every 48 hours. In reality, it's more like it doubles every 48 to 72. So even after 48 hours, if it hasn't quite doubled, it's not like a terrible sign, but it should be rising pretty quickly. So we drew my first one on a Tuesday, I went back on a Thursday, and it had not doubled. My second HCG was around, I think, 120, and I used this online calculator to figure out the rate of growth. I'll link it down below, and I did find it really helpful, although like the normal range is the doubling, so take that with a grain of salt. But anyways, on that Thursday, my doctor called me back and said, we want you to come back in on Monday for another blood draw. I think the rise was like a 33-35% rise. So it hadn't quite doubled, and they just want to check it again and see if it, catches up over the weekend. So over the weekend, I was, trying to remain optimistic. If you don't know, I'm a scientist and I have a biology background, and I actually can read the medical literature pretty well. All of this next week, I did so much research, reading papers, watching YouTube videos, and what I found is that, like I said, the doubling is kind of on the high side. What they really want to see is at least like a 50% increase in 48 hours, which again, mine wasn't. And I did find a couple papers that suggested like 35% was possibly the low end of normal. And so I was convincing myself that everything was fine. This was gonna be fine. On Monday, I went and had my blood drawn again. And this time it was like 230, which I think was a higher increase than before. I think that was like a 45% increase over 48 hours, which was better, but still not where it should be. Like I said, over that next week, I kept digging into the medical literature. I think I was in a little bit in denial because I was looking for evidence and studies to tell me that everything was okay. And I told myself not to freak out because there's no reason to freak out until you know 100% that something is wrong. And, the extra stress would not be good. And during this week, I definitely was having pregnancy symptoms, which is really crazy because my HCG was so low. But I'm fairly positive that the pregnancy symptoms I was experiencing were all from progesterone. Progesterone causes a lot of similar symptoms as HCG. That's why a lot of times before someone gets their period, even if they're not pregnant, they have, similar symptoms to pregnancy, and that's because of the progesterone. And I've always had really good progesterone, and the blood draws that I had during this time showed that my progesterone was high and healthy, and I think it was also making me very sick. I was exhausted. I wasn't necessarily nauseous, but I would randomly gag for no reason and need to throw up. I threw up a couple times that week. Brushing my teeth made me gag. I had a lot of headaches, which I've always kind of been a headachy person. I get headaches really easily, but I was exhausted. I didn't feel great, and I definitely felt like I was pregnant. Not like all the time, it definitely would come and go, which is, completely normal when you're pregnant. But I was definitely having some symptoms during this week, and like I said, I was convincing myself that everything was fine. But my doctor wanted me to come in on that Friday for an ultrasound, because at that point I was going to be 5 weeks and 4 days along. If your dating is right, if you know exactly when you ovulated, which I did, then you should be able to see something in the uterus at 5.5 weeks. Not a baby, but you should be able to see a sac, a yolk sac, a gestational sac. You should be able to see something. So that's why my doctor wanted me to come in that day. So I went on Friday really thinking that, sure, there's a chance that there's something wrong, but there's also a chance that everything's fine. And this is probably where I'm going to get a little emotional, but I went in and we did an ultrasound, a transvaginal ultrasound, and she didn't see anything in my uterus. And she also took a look at my fallopian tubes and said that she could see a mass. It was a small mass. It was about, if I remember, I want to say it was 2.5 centimeters. But she said she could see a mass, and she said there was nothing in the uterus. And I just remember she started talking to me about treatments. So when you have an ectopic, what a lot of people do and what's often recommended is taking a methotrexate shot, which it's actually a chemotherapy drug. What it does is it ends the pregnancy, and then afterwards you are not supposed to get pregnant for 3 months because there is a risk of birth defects and things, because it's a chemotherapy drug. It's very toxic. And honestly, hearing that there was a chance that we wouldn't be able to try for 3 months after losing the pregnancy was harder than even finding out about the ectopic at all. And I just remember sitting there and her telling me these things about the shot and the blood work that I needed to get done before I could get the shot, because they had to make sure that like my liver was functioning and all of this. I just asked her, I was like, how sure are you? Like, how sure are you? Because I'd read stories about women who were told that there was nothing in the uterus and that it was an ectopic pregnancy, but they did a wait and see and they came back a week later and there was something there. And I was just holding out hope that she would say that, you know, maybe we can just wait and see. But I think what happens with those other women, those stories that I've read, I think their dating is off. I think they ovulate later than they thought they did, because a lot of times people use their last period to date things. And if you ovulate later, then you might be earlier in your pregnancy than you think, and that's why you can't see anything. Because my doctor said, you know, if you're sure about your dates, we both were pretty sure about my dates, then she absolutely should be able to see something at that point. And she saw something, a mass in my fallopian tube. So she was sure. She said if this was her sister or her family member, she would be telling them the same thing she's telling me, which was that we probably needed to do this shot. So I go out and do the blood work that we needed to get done, and I go home expecting to have to come back later that day to get the shot. Being the scientist that I am, I get home and I start searching the medical literature, and I start searching the internet about ectopic pregnancies and how to treat them. Because as much as I searched the medical literature the week before, when I knew that an ectopic was a possibility, like I said, I think I was in a little bit of denial, because not once did I look into how ectopic pregnancies are treated. And I was really kicking myself for that, because like I said, the idea of taking this shot that would essentially not allow me to try to conceive for another 3 months, that news was so devastating to me that I really wish I had kind of prepared myself to hear that, but I hadn't looked into that at all. So once I started looking into it, I found that there are actually a group of women where it's okay to do what's called expectant management, which is more of a wait and see approach. And this is not medical advice, because, you know, everybody's situation is a little bit different. I'm just telling you what worked for me and what I read. But basically, women who it's thought might have an ectopic pregnancy, who have an HCG below like 1,500. Some studies, you know, allowed expectant management up to like 3,000, but really like the safer zone is HCG below 1,000 to 1,500. If your HCG is that low and you have no symptoms, which I didn't, I didn't have any pain, I didn't have any bleeding, I had no symptoms. So no symptoms, HCG below 1,500, and if there's a mass, I think the mass size should be like smaller than 3.5. Like I said, this isn't medical advice and I'm pulling these numbers off of memory. But basically, I met all of these criteria for doing more of a wait and see approach. And when I say wait and see, I don't mean wait and see to see if the pregnancy would move to the uterus or become viable. At that point, I knew it was not a viable pregnancy, but what can happen is you can naturally miscarry it. When my doctor called me later that day, because we'd also taken another HCG, she told me that my HCG was now like 225 or something. It was just slightly lower than what it had been on Monday. So it was either holding stable or it was already on its way down. Because of that, she was also comfortable with us not doing any treatment and just waiting to see if the HCG would continue to go down. She scheduled me to come back in on the following Monday to do another HCG draw to make sure it was going down, and she did say that she felt pretty good that it was probably going down, but if on Monday it was stable or if it was going back up, which is something that she has seen in ectopic pregnancies before, that at that point we would need to do the methotrexate shot. So that weekend was a terrible weekend. I literally sat on the couch just watching TV. Actually, I should mention that Friday after I talked to my doctor, I went over to my mom's house where some of my family members gathered, and we all kind of grieved together. Just like we had celebrated together, we were sad together. I explained to them, you know, everything the doctor said, and because I understand medical terminology and like the way medicine works a little bit better than they did. I tried to explain it to them, and it was a sad day. And then on Saturday and Sunday, like I said, I was a couch potato. I cried. I watched TV. And actually, there was a few times over the weekend where where I actually did feel pain. So my ectopic, the mass was on the right side, and they could also tell that that was the side that I had ovulated on. And there were a few times where I had felt pain, which was a little scary. My doctor did say if I felt like sharp pains for longer than 15 minutes, I needed to go to the emergency room because those were signs of a rupture. A rupture, if you don't know, is really dangerous because it causes internal bleeding. If that happened, I would be losing a fallopian tube. So all very bad things, and reasons why most doctors would not allow someone to do expectant management, especially if their HCG was higher than mine was. So I was definitely taking a risk by not taking the shot. And that's a risk that some people may not want to take, which I totally understand. But for me, I felt comfortable making that risk, and that's something that everybody should, decide for themselves. And like I said, this is not medical advice. Anyways, there were a few times over the weekend where I felt pain, just like an achiness, like a dull achiness on my right side. And that was really, really hard for me because even though logically I knew that this isn't what was happening, but emotionally it felt like I could feel my baby dying. And at this point, it's a clump of cells, right? And it's also, my HCG was already going down. So the pregnancy was already ending. But emotionally, that's what it felt like. And it was a really hard weekend. So I go back to the doctor's office on Monday, do another blood draw, and Monday afternoon, I get a phone call to say it's down to like 1:30. So pregnancy is definitely ending on its own. My HCG is going down on its own. I'm out of the woods as far as needing a methotrexate shot, which was really great news. At this point, I hadn't started bleeding yet, and I didn't know when that was going to happen. But Monday night, the bleeding starts. I wasn't really sure what to expect. I assumed it was going to be heavier and longer than like maybe a normal period, which actually ended up not quite being true. It actually was shorter and lighter than a normal period for me. However, it was pretty painful, at least the first couple of days. The first night especially, Monday night, I remember I was very uncomfortable. I had a heating pad, I took ibuprofen, I was on the couch, I cried a lot. But my pain was cramping like period cramps, but it was the worst period cramps I've ever had. I'd say on a scale of like 1 to 10, I was at a level 4 of pain, like definitely uncomfortable, even with the heating pad and the medication that I was taking. It was mostly that bad at night. I woke up in the morning and I was still bleeding, but the pain was a lot better. But then interestingly, later that night, it became a little more painful again, which I think is interesting because I think it kind of mirrors early labor. A lot of times labor either starts at night or is worse at night. So Tuesday was also fairly painful, but I'd say it was more of like a 3. I was able to just zone out and watch TV and kind of forget about it. I mean, not totally, but I tried to forget about it. And then the next couple of days, I was just spotting and it's kind of achy, but totally like normal period pains for me. So that was how my actual like miscarriage experience happened. And like I said at the beginning of this video, I wanted to share this story because not a lot of people have this type of ectopic pregnancy experience, and I want people to know that yes, ectopics are scary. Most people don't find out they have one until they're having a rupture, and that is life-threatening and it's scary. But I want people to know that it can also be not life-threatening in some circumstances and not as scary. I didn't need to take the shot. I didn't need to do anything. My body took care of it on its own. I would have never known that I had an ectopic pregnancy if it hadn't been for being followed so closely by my doctor because I'm seeing a fertility specialist. So even though this ectopic pregnancy was obviously not great, in the scheme of ectopic pregnancies, it was actually kind of like the best case scenario because it ended up just being kind of like an early pregnancy loss. I didn't need any interventions. I can get back to trying to conceive whenever I feel emotionally ready. And so I'm really grateful that things worked out the way that they did, just because it could have been a lot worse. So after losing the pregnancy, I want to talk about a little bit about like my healing process. Because we had told so many people, our close friends and family, about the pregnancy, I also had to tell over text, which I appreciate instead of calling or seeing people in person. I told them that the pregnancy was ectopic and it wasn't viable, and we weren't going to have an April baby. I stopped reading during this time. I stopped making videos. I've talked about this a little bit in some of my previous YouTube videos that are about books, about, having something traumatic happen to me in August, and that's why I was kind of not doing the things that I normally do. And honestly, it's taken me a good month and a half to kind of feel myself and feel the energy to be productive. I was a couch potato for almost a month. Like, I just watched a lot of reality TV and laid on the couch. I played some video games, and I let myself kind of wallow in it and be sad because it's sad. And I found this analogy to something called the grief button or the grief box. It definitely helped me a little bit because the grief kind of comes and goes. Obviously, in the beginning, I was very upset for a lot of the time. And then I got to a point where, like, I was mostly okay. I was still kind of sad, but I wasn't crying all the time. But then these, like, really random, weird things would make me cry. Like, I remember the first day that after being pregnant when I made a second cup of coffee in the afternoon, and I cried because that's, like, not something that I did when I was pregnant. I only let myself have, like, one cup of coffee in the morning, and that was it. And just the act of, like, making a second one made me cry. Even just, like, last week, so this is a couple months after this whole experience, I was listening to a song while I was working. It was a song about a breakup, but I started applying those lyrics to the pregnancy, and I just started crying, and I was so emotional that day. So it comes and goes. Some days I'm okay. Most days, these days, I'm okay. But some days, little things will remind me of the pregnancy, and I'll be sad, and I know that that's never gonna go away. Like, next April, around the time of the due date of this pregnancy, I know I will be really sad. I'm really hoping by then I will be pregnant again and have something happy to look forward to and to help me kind of get through that day. I mean, 2020 has already been a tough year for everybody, but I also actually, like, before this, back in June, I had another, like, traumatic thing kind of happen in my life, more so to my parents. They had a couple of pet losses, and I'm a big dog person, so that was really hard for me. And I also lost an uncle earlier this year, and so 2020 had already been kind of, like, not a great year because obviously the pandemic as well. And when we got pregnant, I was just so happy. We were both so happy, and we were like, okay, this is our luck finally turning around, and we have, like, a light at the end of the tunnel after this terrible year. I mean, the 2 weeks that I was pregnant, I don't want to say they were, like, the happiest 2 weeks of my life because that sounds so dramatic, but I was very happy even though I felt crappy. And then to have that taken away after just 2 weeks, like, it was only 2 weeks, and it just felt so cruel to have something that we want so badly, like, dangled in front of our faces. But every day it gets a little bit easier. Like I said, I'm finally feeling back to myself. I've been reading again. I'm making videos again. If whoever's watching this likes videos about books or likes to read, consider subscribing and hanging around, because that's what I usually talk about here. But I just wanted to make this video, like I said, mostly for me so that I can rewatch it if I want to, but also for other women who have gone through this or are going through this. You're not alone, and maybe it's not as scary as some of the really scary stories that you've read online, because that's what I found was a lot of what is online are kind of like at the scary end of the spectrum, but it is a spectrum. And for me, while it was definitely a really sad thing, it actually ended up being the best case scenario out of a terrible situation. And now I am, getting back to my life, and we're getting back to trying to conceive again. So everybody cross your fingers and send us your best wishes and baby dust, and hopefully in the next year or so I can come back here and tell you guys that we have some better news. If you made it to the end of this video, I really appreciate you watching and for all of your support, and I will see you guys in another video. Bye. I feel like I have a lot of, oh god, because as much as I searched that news was so, no, really had wished that I had, here, take this. It definitely ended up being the best case situation out of a terrible scenario. It definitely ended up being the best case scenario, no. It actually ended up being like the best case situation out of a terrible scenario. I keep saying that backwards. Bye.